Well, thank you, Dr. Tessier-Levine, for this welcome at Rockefeller University. My first time on this campus, I trust not the last. I certainly want to thank the members of the Meister Greengard Prize Selection Committee for inviting me to be a part of this celebration. And Joan Stites, where are you? There, right in the front. We met in the elevator earlier this evening. I want to congratulate you for your important work, and I certainly look forward to hearing more this evening about your accomplishments. And finally, I want to commend Ursula von Ridingbard and Paul Greengard for establishing this prize. What a wonderful tribute to your mother, for women scientists, for the continuity of life. It's my honor this evening to be here, and especially to salute Dr. Stites, who dives deeply into the inner workings of cells using technologies that were simply unimaginable a century ago. Tonight, I want to share with you some of the joy I have had of diving into the ocean and reflect on what is being discovered that relates to the health of the planet, and that, of course, to the health of humans and for life on Earth generally. And I want to begin by sharing a little video clip about some exploration that took place using submersibles, a submersible, a very special one, that was used about the same year that Dr. Paul Greengard arrived on the planet. This was about 80 years ago. So could we have that first video clip, please? Imagine what it was like in the early 1930s, going to the waters not too far from where we are here, off the coast of Bermuda, the place well known to our fellow mammals, the humpback whales, as well as to legions of creatures that occupy the ocean from the surface to the greatest depths. Here, Beebe and his engineer associate, William Barton, clambering into this hollow sphere that was forged not far from here in New York State, and then lowered into the depths as much as half a mile beneath the surface. They were the first humans to actually witness and verify that the ocean is alive, filled with life. We now know more than was known at the time about the great diversity of life in the ocean, the census of marine life. Jesse Osabel, who's with us in the audience tonight, had much to do with pioneering this just inventory of who shares life on Earth with us. We think of the diversity of life in rainforests as being wonderful, and it is, but the life in the ocean, nearly all of the major divisions of life, the animal life, the bacteria, the plants, the microbes that have ever lived on Earth, those major divisions, by and large, are still out there in the ocean. It's like diving into the history of life on Earth when you go beneath the surface and on into the depths of the sea. And to witness at first hand one of the most common forms of communication on Earth. It's not cell phones, it's bioluminescence. On the order of 90% of the creatures that live in the deep sea have some form of making their own living light. Up until the time that Beebe and Barton made their historic journey into the depths, journeys, there were several times when they plunged into the Sargasso Sea, this place where there's a floating golden forest. It's like a rainforest, but it's even wetter than rainforests, with a virtual zoo of creatures. Some of them live only in this floating forest. Christopher Columbus knew about this floating forest, and other sailors, those who go from New York to Bermuda, encounter sometimes these vast forests that float in the open sea. But getting to know who lives there and the significance of these floating systems to the carbon cycle, to the nitrogen cycle, to the oxygen cycle, to the cycle of life itself. These are things that we're beginning now, decades later, to see how all of these things fit together and how we are a part of the living systems that make up most of the planet out there in the ocean. I'd like to switch now to some slides, images. It'll take us deeper and wider. We're now in the deep, deep sea, where it's always dark, except for bioluminescence, of course. This is the time that we can begin to celebrate the access that we have, not just to the skies above that have given us that perspective back on ourselves, but into the depths below. Because of the new technologies that have come along since the era of William Beebe and Otis Barton, we have learned more about the ocean than during all preceding human history. Things that were not known even when I was a child, or when Rachel Carson wrote The Sea Around Us in 1951. The existence of the mountain chains that run down the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans, of hydrothermal vents, of the fact that the continents move around. I was taught in my first class of oceanography to scoff at the very idea that the continents can move and shift. But now we know. Now we have the means to get out and see calamari swimming in something other than lemon slices and butter, to get to see them actually in their own realm, to enjoy the splendor of life on Earth that was truly inaccessible to humankind, except on one-way trips into the ocean. Those are easy. It's round trips, going down and coming back, that really count. Getting to know something about this great spectacle, this spectrum of life in the sea, from sponges to the jellies, this range of creatures that have no counterpart, or very few in some cases, on terrestrial or freshwater environments. It's getting into the sea that has just transformed our understanding of the ocean. And now, of course, with other means that we have with underwater robots and autonomous vehicles that can swim on their own. But there is nothing like taking yourself into the ocean and actually being face to face with creatures that are easy to find in the supermarket, but there's no substitute for the real thing swimming in the ocean itself. One thing that I discovered by actually being in the ocean as a diver, living underwater from time to time, is getting to see the fish have faces, like cats and dogs and people, horses and things. Everyone is an individual, each with its own DNA recipe, with its own RNA, with its own fingerprint that sets every grouper apart from every other one. They have different attitudes too. Some are curious, like this one, wants to know what is this primate coming down into its backyard. It's just such a glorious experience. My mother waited until she was 81 before taking the plunge and getting to see the ocean from the inside out. And she scolded me after that. Why didn't you get me into the ocean sooner? And if she were here tonight, she'd say, if you're 81, don't wait any longer. It's there to be done. As long as you breathe, you can dive. At least that's what I tell people when they ask me, do you still dive? As long as I breathe, I expect to be taking the plunge, getting to see these creatures on their own terms, using the ocean as a laboratory, getting to see those creatures on their own terms, face to face, nose to nose. Even the biggest fish in the sea, relatively unknown until quite recently. Now, we're getting to understand that the spots on every great whale shark is different from the spots on any other whale shark. They behave differently. It should not come as a big surprise when you look around. Humans, everyone, through all of history, it has been a unique individual. Why should it be different from other forms of life? And yet, somehow, It's taken until fairly recent times for that concept to get across, that they're all separate individuals. Every leatherback sea turtle, getting to see them and their other sea turtle relatives. Now, like turtles, our fellow mammals, seals, and whales can only dive as deep and as long as they can hold their breath. For sperm whales, that can be as much as a mile for as long as an hour. For humans, it's not quite that deep, and certainly not that long, unless you go with equipment such as this, the underwater laboratory. Dozens have been developed since I was a child, mostly developed since the 1970s. The first time I had a chance to live underwater was for 2 weeks in 1970. Most recently, last July, when I spent a week in Aquarius down in the Florida Keys. This was only at 20 meters, although some systems have enabled people to go and stay as much as 500 meters and stay for weeks at a time. But like last summer, with some of my fellow scientists, we had a chance to not just stay inside where there were microscopes and other equipment, but also there were heavy-duty kinds of equipment placed on the reef outside where we could go and explore and be entertainment for the fish who came and peered in the windows. This is the door in the floor that enabled us to swim in and out freely, day and night, to go out and meet and visit with the fish and look at the instruments wired to our home base, and to see the creatures that had actually adapted our underwater laboratory as their home. I revel in the new technologies that now enable us to have access to the sea, like astronauts who can go up in the sky. Think of what we would not know, but for the development of telescopes, of microscopes, of submarines that enable us to see better the subjects that we are interested in. I particularly like this and other variations on the theme of little submarines that are so simple to drive that even a scientist can do it. I am living proof. You can make it a team sport if you wish. Take several scientists down at once, or even have a driver if you wish. Just a few weeks ago, I visited the deepest diving scientific submersible now in existence. No, it's not in Europe or in this country or Canada, it's in China. China has taken the lead in terms of the deepest diving submersible dedicated to science that has ever been built, 7,000 meters. And we do have systems. The Alvin has been a leader since the 1960s, taking hundreds of scientists into the sea to explore the ocean from the inside out. I was allowed to climb inside of the Sea Dragon, as they call this new vehicle, and dream about what it must be like to go as deep in the sea as airplanes fly high in the sky. Well, actually, there's one system that goes as high as I flew this morning from India to get here. I arrived about 4 a.m. at the airport from New Delhi. India, too, is building a submersible dedicated for science to go to 6,000 meters. But it was Jim Cameron, an entrepreneur, a scientist, an artist, a movie director, a Canadian who spends much of his time in the United States when he's not traveling around, to invest his time, his talent, his own resources over 8 years to build a system that can go to the deepest part of the ocean, 7 miles down, 11,000 meters, truly as high in this, deep in the ocean as aircraft tend to fly in the sky. Last March, he successfully went for the second time in history to the deepest place. Previously, 1960, 2 men made that trip. They only went for 20 minutes. He actually stayed for 2.5 hours, exploring the depths, confirming that life exists, yes, high in the sky, with spiders that fly on webs high in the stratosphere, with insects, with birds, bats, and in the ocean, the plankton in the sea that exists from the surface to the greatest depths. And he witnessed this and brought back information just as our honoree this evening dives deeply into cells and brings back the mysteries and reports to us what she sees and shares that information. The combination of the human intellect with the technologies that we have mastered and mustered to the case to bring new insights into where are we in the greater scheme of things. As Ed Wilson has expressed in his most recent book about the social conquest of Earth, who are we? Where have we come from? And where are we going? The big questions, looking at it from the inner workings of the cell to the deep, wide workings of the planet itself. That's the opportunity that we now have, that we could not have before this point in time. It's a magic time. I call it the sweet spot in history, because before we could not know the things that are now within our reach. Another 50 years, even another 10 years, may be too late for us to act on some of the knowledge now within our grasp, knowing the value of the existence of life, of chemosynthesis in the deep sea that was not known half a century ago. Now, some interests are focusing on mining the deep sea before we even answer questions about the role of the archaea, those deep-dwelling microbes that have mastered chemosynthesis, not using light to fix energy. Looking at the diversity of life in the deep sea, most of it still to be explored. We've only looked at perhaps 5% of the ocean. That means we're entering the greatest era of exploration, not just of the sea, but in every dimension of science. We're opening doors all the time that lead to more doors that need to be opened. Here we are at a point in time, maybe in the deep sea, or it will come forth. Have I pushed the wrong button? Let's see. Let's try this. We're back in the deep sea. And then try it again. Must be. It was working 5 minutes ago. Anyway, there we go. Onward to this. Just a brief look at what we can do that those mighty minds of centuries ago could not, they didn't know enough to even dream of what we now can reflect upon, about the deep history of our species. Longer than 100,000 years ago, there were humans on Earth. But over the last 100,000 years, it's been tough going. When you consider the ups and downs of temperature, of climate, of ice age fluctuations, when greater ice, lesser ice, up and down, circumstances that up until 10,000 years ago have been pretty rocky in terms of a planet that was in our favor. We were here as humans, but only in the last 10,000 years have things sort of settled down to a state that has enabled our prosperity to really take off in a way that we now tend to take for granted. And we've been so complacent about a planet that works in our favor that we have been lax, we've been complacent, we have not thought about the conscious effort that we need to take care of the systems that give us the benefits that we now are seeing at risk. The oxygen in the atmosphere, we shouldn't take it as a given. It took all preceding history to get us to the point that we now really enjoy and do tend to take for granted. The growing human pressures, there are now, 7 billion of us. When I arrived on the planet, about 2 billion. I and many of you in this audience have seen this, well, all of us have seen this unprecedented, apparent prosperity that has come at a cost that we are now, for the first time, being able to put in perspective, to understand there are limits to how much we can extract from the natural systems that give us everything. The great gift that came as a consequence of burning the ancient fuels. We've had access to the skies above and certainly to the depths below. Perhaps the greatest gift that has been derived from the burning of fossil fuels over the past century, especially the last half century, and the pace is picking up on coal, oil, gas, is we need to change our ways. The greatest gift is knowledge. The system of being able to communicate around the world driven by our access to energy that makes this possible, to satellites in the sky. But we must think of alternatives. We now know that we didn't know 50 years ago, didn't know 500 years ago. If we wait 50 years to change course, there won't be 500 years to reflect back, perhaps, on the opportunity that we have in our grasp now. Imagine that only in our time, on our watch, has Earth looked like this from afar, burning through the deep assets to propel us into a more prosperous future if we get it together. We couldn't know about the capacity to accelerate the melting of ice. Of course, it's happened in the past. It will happen in the future, with us or without us. But with us, we can measure what we are doing. Just a report that I read today about how the past summer has been the greatest time of melting of ice in the Arctic so far in our history. Melting of the ice larger than the United States. Well, that's kind of bad news for creatures who live in the Arctic, who depend on that ice cover. Bad news, too, for us. Think Katrina. Dare I say, think Sandy. Think of the consequences of heightened power in storms, of unpredictable weather, about predictably increased temperature, but the destabilization of systems that give us things that we have taken for granted, certainly during my lifetime. It never occurred to me as a kid going to the Florida Keys and to other coral reefs around the world that I would live to see the loss of more than half of the coral reefs, or the serious decline of, in some cases, as much as 80% of the coral reef cover. And it's accelerating. They may be gone by the middle of this century, based on some calculations. Why? Well, climate change is one factor, but the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere driving acidification of the ocean is another. The bleaching of coral driven by warming seas is one thing. Our appetite for creatures who live in coral reefs, the fish, is another factor that we're just beginning to take into account. But it isn't just the big things, it's the little things, maybe most importantly, the microbes, because they respond quickly, most quickly, to changes in chemistry. They're also the creatures that are most important in terms of generating oxygen, taking up carbon, driving the chemistry of Earth itself. We're just beginning to realize our capacity to alter the nature of nature through what we put into the atmosphere, what we put into the sea, whether it's something that you can't really see, like acidification of the ocean, like carbon dioxide in the air, in the ocean itself, or the big things, like the plastics that have come along. I come from the pre-Plasticozoic era. Many of you have too. So humans can get along without it. I choose not to. I love plastics. It's what we do with them when we're through with them, or thinking about a full life cycle, not just of plastics, but the many things that we construct and then just throw away, to the great trauma of much of life on Earth that we haven't thought about before. We didn't think we had to. But now we know that what we put into places that we think of as away come back to haunt us, haunt the creatures who have to live with the inheritance that go into the ocean. These colorful things that look like food that albatrosses feed to their chicks, and then the chicks never get to be grown-up albatrosses. Or go to the other end of the world, to Antarctica, where certainly we're seeing the effects of a warming planet, but it's also a place that is most unlikely place for humans to appear as major predators on ecosystems. 50 years ago, it wasn't a factor in the life and times of creatures there at all. We couldn't easily get to Antarctica half a century ago. But now fleets of ships are going to Antarctica to take the food out of the mouths of penguins, seals, sea lions, whales, the whole lot. Krill, one of the most abundant creatures on Earth, but critically important because they affect the food chains, the chemistry of the southern oceans. And there we are, extracting them, millions of tons of krill, of deep sea ice fish. Some of them take 30 years to mature, maybe 100 years, like this little orange roughy that appears in my local supermarket for $8.99 a pound, but they may live to be 2 centuries. Wouldn't you like to know how to live to be 2 centuries old and be healthy and still reproducing as these little fish have somehow mastered the fine art of doing that? There's secrets that they have that might be far more valuable to us than how they taste on a plate. So far, we've been fairly crude in our appreciation of most wildlife in the sea, thinking of them mainly as sources of protein. Orange roughy, there you see them. They're actually rather small fish, considering their great age, but look at all the other things that are caught in the process of taking them. A bulldozer approach to taking wildlife from the sea. Tunas have become so regular on menus around the world that the very thought that you might have to stop eating tuna is appalling to many. What? My sushi? Protect my sushi. But if we aren't careful, there won't be any tuna for sushi going into the next century or even the middle of this century. When I served as the chief scientist of NOAA, a little piece of paper came across my desk saying that 90% of the bluefins in the North Atlantic were already gone. Shouldn't we do something about that, I asked. I mean, are we trying to exterminate them? Because if we are, we're doing a great job. We only have 10% left to go. Well, of course we don't want to exterminate them. They're valuable to us as a luxury item in our diet, but they're far more valuable to us swimming in the sea as a part of those great ocean food chains that shape the chemistry of the planet that is our only home. Sharks used to be thought of as bad creatures. The only good shark, a dead shark. But now we know if we're close to getting our wish, no more sharks in the sea, maybe 90% of them are gone. They've been around for 300 million years. And on our watch, our capacity to take them for a luxury item, a macho meal, a shark steak or shark fin soup. You know, we used to do it with whales before we understood the real value of whales. There are whales still being taken for food, for oil, but by and large, we've taken a different direction. We can change. We have that capacity, but it starts with knowing that there are values that transcend wildlife, natural systems as commodities. We're beginning to get it. We're beginning to look with new eyes at the economic value of nature. The Economist had a big conference in Singapore just last February, calling on nations of the world to look at the underlying economy, those hidden values that we're beginning to put on the balance sheet, like, do you like to breathe? Do you like water that falls out of the sky? Do you like a planet that works in your favor? I mean, these are questions that for the first time are beginning to be seriously asked at the Rio Plus 20 conference in the past June in Brazil. Nations being, for the first time, really seriously considering their blue backyards. There's another whole United States out there. It's the blue part, out 200 miles. Small island nations are actually big ocean nations, like those in the Pacific, like Bermuda, looking around and saying, oh, we have a chance to get it right as we use the new technologies, the new insight about the value of the planet to us. New value for things like mangroves. About half of them are already gone because people love the coasts. They get rid of the trees so they can put hotels right on the beach. But now, with increasing storms, with a loss of shores, the Gulf of Mexico, the Philippines, throughout the world, wherever mangroves live, they're beginning to be viewed with new values because they generate oxygen, they grab carbon, Turns out that they have a capacity to grab and hold about 50 times the amount, up to as much as 50 times the amount of carbon as trees in a forest on the land, because they have these roots that hold the carbon and into the sediments below. Good news, we're restoring mangroves. This is a picture in China where they are getting it. They understand the value of marshes, of seagrass meadows. Wouldn't it be great if New York still had its vast oyster beds of the 17 and 18 and early 1900s, but they're basically gone. It's like a great insurance policy out there, protection against storms, against high waves. It's true too with these seagrass meadows that hold the sediment, hold the bottom in place, as well as producing a lot of oxygen, taking up a lot of carbon. The whole idea of blue carbon is just beginning to be appreciated, whether it's the Sargasso Sea or the small creatures that live in the water itself. Good news, Hong Kong, throughout Asia, kids, bless the kids, they're beginning to understand. It's their future that's on the line. Well, it's ours too. They have a chance, we have a chance to take action, to do what these kids are pledging to do. Save the sharks, save the turtles, save the ocean, save ourselves. It is happening. This is that moment when, if you see kids with pro-chlorococcus t-shirts, you know that some good changes are taking place. This mighty microbe that generates 1 in every 5 breaths we take, whose existence was unknown until 1986. What else is out there? What else is down there? What else is in there, within the cells of our own bodies, that we need to understand that we are just on the edge of this greatest era of exploration ever? So finally, this image. This is a bird I met last January, halfway across the Pacific, Midway Island. It's a Laysan albatross. It's a girl. Her name is Wisdom. She's been named by those who have come to know her over the last 61 years. She's sitting on her most recent egg. We know how old she is because she was banded early in her life. She was actually learning to fly at about the same time that I was learning to dive. And at about the same time that she chose, or there was a mutual understanding between 2 Laysan albatrosses, of course, Wisdom in her wisdom, and her mate. It takes about 10 to 14 years for this process to occur before they decide to pair up for life. It was at about that time, perhaps, that Joan Stites was first peering into microscopes and trying to figure out what goes on in the depths of cells. Well, here we are. Think of what has happened in the last 6 decades. Half the albatrosses are female. I don't have to point that out. Half the fish are female too. And they do the heavy lifting right along with their pals. And it's time, of course, in celebrating this evening's honoree and the concept that underlies that, to celebrate what women do with their male counterparts over the last 100,000 years, to imagine what will the next 100,000 be, and to reflect on this. This point in history, this pivotal point in time, will determine, probably more than any other time in history, because as never before we know what we know. As never again will there be a better time to act on that knowledge, whether it's on a planetary scale, the health of the planet, or right down to our individual selves and human health. I just want to salute those of you who have gathered this evening for all that you're doing, all that has been done to bring together this special occasion, and to thank you for your vision. Thank you for making the world a better place.